Hello everyone. Last week I attended the Solid Symposium and I gave a couple of talks. And today I want to share with you the first one, thoughts on Solid developer experience. In case someone doesn't know who I am, my name is Noel and I'm a developer and entrepreneur. I am currently working 4 days a week at Moodle and I am making Solid apps on the side. I also work in the open, so everything you see here today is open source, and you can learn more about me and my work in my website, where I regularly journal about my development process. So I started doing Solid apps about 5 years ago, and so far I have made this, maybe you have seen some of them, and when I started at the time this was my stack. I was using Laravel for the backend and Vue.js and Tailwind CSS for the frontend. However, when I decided to start experimenting with Solid, I wasn't sure how I should do it. For example, I supposed I should stop using Laravel because my applications are going to work in the frontend and the data is stored in the pod, not in an SQL database. But Solid is a protocol, it's not an implementation or a framework, so it's not immediately obvious how to get started with that. In my case, I had already started working on a library called Sokai, and I added Solid support in it. That's what I'm going to talk about today. You can learn more about the library in this website. Before we get started into the specifics of Sokai, I have to introduce the active record design pattern. This is an object that wraps a row in a database table or view, encapsulates the database access, and adds domain logic on that data. For our case in particular, I would say that we would wrap an RDF resource in a container and encapsulate the network requests. So for example, since I started making my first application, I was giving a choice to users if they wanted to store their data locally or in a Solid pod. Thanks to this design pattern, since the database access is encapsulated, I could define a model once, and using different engines, the data would be stored in different places, like a browser storage or the Solid pod. If you want to use Solid with the library, you have to install this extension called Sokai Solid. And before moving forward, something I asked the room at the symposium is how many people agreed that RDF is complicated. In this case, you have to keep in mind that this was an audience of people already experimented with Solid and RDF, and still about half the room raised their hand in agreement. This is something I usually see when I introduce people to Solid who are not familiar with RDF, and they think that it's too complicated, right? But I think it can actually be made a lot easier. For example, when I started, I made these mappings in my head and it was quite useful. I thought of the RDF and the RDF schema as object-oriented programming, like we have classes and properties. Also, I thought about a container in a pod as a database collection, and I thought of each resource in the container as a database document. And using this mental mapping, I think it makes RDF a lot more approachable and easy. I am aware that there is more things in RDF that make it more complicated, and there are also some real use cases why that's necessary, but I don't think that's something we should introduce to developers who are just getting started. So the idea is to reduce the complexity at the beginning. So when I look at RDF, for example, in this case we are looking at a turtle document. We are actually looking at a serialization. So we have a movie with a watch action, but this is in turtle format. You could also represent the same information using, for example, JSON-LD. But in reality, when I am looking at RDF data, this is what I am thinking about the abstract schema of the data. So we have a movie with two properties, name and date published. They are using the schema ontology. And we also have another object, which is the watch action. And using the object property, it's pointing to a movie. So this is how you should think, or how I think about RDF to simplify it. I don't think about the specific serializations. But when I am working on my applications, the way I think about the data is actually like this. Instead of saying name, I prefer to call title to the property of the movie. And instead of saying object as the property linking the watch action and the movie, I prefer to say movie URL. So when I am making my apps, I think it's important for a good developer experience to use the terms I like to work with. So what the library does is that it allows you to create this mapping. You define a model, and using your own terms, you tell how they are translated into the ontology that will be used when serializing the data. For example, here we can see how you would write a model for the movie. In this case, first you declare the context you are using. For us, we are only using one, schema.org. Then you define the class, in this case the schema movie, and then you define the fields for the model. So we have a title, and we can add additional restrictions like saying that this is required, and also we have a release date. Also notice how we have some complex types, not just the simple literals in RDF. For example, here using something like a date, we can take care of the serialization and use the native date object in JavaScript. This is how you would define the watch action using the similar ideas. And once you have defined the models, this is how you would use them. For example, you can create a new instance using the add method to indicate the container where it will be stored, and also using the create method to pass the attributes for this model. Once you do that, a network request will be launched if you are using the pod for the storage, and you will get back an object with the data. In this case, a URL that has been created and the title that we also passed. You can also read data, for example, using the all method to get all the movies from a container, and you can also use the find method to get a specific instance. Furthermore, you can also use update, and as I mentioned before, you can use native JavaScript dates. You don't have to think about the serialization, and you can also delete using the delete format. So with these basic operations, we have seen how we can create and manipulate instances of resources. However, there is still something we need to take care of, and that is the link between both instances. Of course, you could create two instances and just set the movie URL attribute to the URL of the movie, but this library comes with some things that help you do that as well. For example, you can define a method ending in the relationship name, and in this method you can indicate how different models relate to one another. In this case, we can say that a movie has one watch action, and the link between them is used in the movie URL property. Notice how we are using the terms we define in our own application, not the RDF lingo. Once you do that, you will have some new things in the class. For example, you can have a watch action attribute, and this will be the instance of the related watch action if it exists, or null otherwise. So you can use that to discern if a movie has been watched or not. Also, if you want to mark a movie as watched, you just have to create a new watch action instance. However, using the relationships, you can also make that easier, because you don't have to indicate the properties that link to each other, given that the library already knows that. And using this type of thing, it can make your life a lot easier. So this is an example of how you would write code to work with a movies manager in just a few lines. For example, you can use the all method to get all the movies in the pod. Then you can use the watched getter we implemented to filter which movies are pending or not. You can also create a new movie using the create method, and you can mark a movie as watched using the watch method. And as you can see, this is quite easy to understand, and there isn't a lot of things specific to Solid. So any newcomer should be able to understand this. And there are more things I will not get into today, but for example, we have magic attributes with full TypeScript support. We already saw one of these with the watch action related instance. Also, there is automatic URL minting that you can configure if you want, but out of the box you don't have to think about that. Also, there are some methods to output data in different serialization formats in case you need them to interact with other services. And finally, it keeps track of all the changes that happen in the model. This is actually something I talked about on the second presentation in the Symposium, and I will also upload the presentation shortly. So keep an eye on that if you are interested. And if you want to learn more about the library, I suggest you to read the documentation where all the features are documented. So yeah, before moving forward, something I wanted to raise is the importance of the learning curve. When someone is getting started with a new technology, it's important that they are able to get started quickly and get some early wins, because otherwise it's very difficult to get excited for a new technology. And I think in our case in Solid, this is something we are not paying a lot of attention to, because it's not really easy to get started and we have a lot of concepts and ideas. So I think that for beginners, it's better to just have the basics and help them get started quickly. Also, there is this concept called conceptual compression, and I suggest that you read this blog post by DHH, who is the creator of Ruby on Rails, that also uses Active Record. In this blog post, he talks about how using conceptual compression, it's possible for beginners to get started making applications without knowing the specifics of SQL. And for our case, I would say the same, and we can get beginners started without knowing RDF. So this is one goal that I think it's good to have in mind. So yeah, when I started, as I mentioned, I replaced my backend with Sokai, and that was it. But as I continued working in more applications, I realized that there are more things in Solid that affect the application, not only the data layer. So eventually I started doing Solid things in the rest of my application. And because of that, I have been working on a new project which I called Aerogel, and this is a framework to make Solid applications. It is a work in progress, it's still not finished, but I will share a couple of things with you today. So for example, the idea is that you can create a new application really quickly using this command, and you already have the application with everything you need. You can also use some components to get some basic functionality. For example, using the HG Solid status, you can get a login form and some data of the currently logged in user with a logout button. Also, it comes with some services out of the box. For example, you can use the Solid service to see if the user is logged in or not and get the data from their profile, like the name or the avatar. And since Aerogel is integrated with Sokai, using all the code we have seen before, you could get all the movies from the pod really easily. So with this, with all the code we have seen in this presentation, you would have 90% that you need to get started with Solid to do this kind of application. One application that shows the list of movies you have in your pod. So I think this is the kind of developer tools we should strive for. Something that helps people get started quickly and allow them to focus on the business logic of their application rather than dealing with the headaches of Solid and RDF. So yeah, some additional benefit of that is that when I started working with Solid, as I mentioned, I was giving users a choice if they wanted to store data locally or in a Solid pod. But as time moved on and I started working on different applications, I realized that a better experience for users is actually to get started using the browser storage, and whenever they are ready, they can synchronize the data with the pod, but they don't have to change the system, right? So using this pattern, the Active Record, it was quite easy for me to change that without having to change the code of the application. And an additional benefit of that is that also now everything could happen in browser storage and the syncing can happen on the background. So thanks to this, we can implement local first applications, which is an idea that I think pairs really well with Solid. This also has some implications in the UI. For example, this is one screenshot from my application, Umai, to configure how the syncing works. And this is something that I also want to have in Aerogel out of the box, so that people don't have to think too much about all these things that are common between different applications. Finally, I think something very important in developer experience is a good testing framework, and for me Cypress is one of the best tools for the job. So I created this package called Cypress Solid, and you can actually use it even if you don't use Vue or Sokai. It should work with any JavaScript project using Cypress. So with this plugin, you will be able to configure a pod and interact with all the data that you need to set up for your tests without having to deal with the requests themselves. So check it out if you are interested. So yeah, there are more things that will be included with Aerogel, for example, internationalization, which I think it's important. Also some error handling, because there are some errors that are very specific to Solid and beginners may not be able to handle them, or they may not know what to do with them. So some error handling will come out of the box. Also, I think this is one of the most important things we should take advantage of in the Solid community, because you can make Solid applications that are front-end only, you don't need a backend. And thanks to that, it should be possible for anyone to get started really quickly. For example, something I want to do with Aerogel is that whenever you create a new application and you host it in GitHub, it comes configured out of the box to use GitHub pages. So that is something that I think would be really nice for people to start working with their applications. Also, it comes with some forms and validation to make things easier. And there are more features I'm thinking on, and this is still developing, so keep an eye on that. If you want, in this YouTube channel, you can find some videos where I have gone through code using aerogel, so you can look at them to see how the code actually looks and how you use all of this. So yeah, that's it for the presentation, but I didn't want to finish without giving a shout out to this website, rdfjs.dev. And as I mentioned, 5 years ago there weren't as many libraries, but today things have improved a lot. So if you don't like Active Record, you can also check out this website for other libraries. And if you are curious about Solid in general, you can see how it can be used with different approaches. So I would suggest you that you look at this website. And yeah, that's it for me today. If you have any questions or any comments, please let me know. Thank you.